Alright everyone, welcome to episode 2 of the Weekend Binge for Stranger Things Season 1. Covering episode 2, obviously, being The Weirdo on Maple Street. And you're going to notice a bit of a format change compared to how I did the previous video. One, it's not going to be nearly as long. And two, in my notes, I started to categorize things more instead of just doing it sort of not stream of consciousness, but as the show went along. So I will be categorizing things into groups, and that is primarily groups of people within the show. Occasionally kind of spreading off into the some major events as they occur, but for the most part it will be focused on the group. So I'm going to shut up about that, and let's get right into it. So, one of the biggest things really throughout this entire season, them being the main characters, but especially in this episode, is the boys and Eleven. Now, obviously the boys being the three musketeers, since poor Will is in the ether. But the boys and Eleven, or as I will try to refer to them going forward as simply the kids. And I mean, it's the establishment of this friendship, a very rocky friendship to say the least, that gets developed over time, but essentially this is the way that the different characters approach the situation. Mike is very concerned. He's very concerned about this girl that they just found out in the rain, and he wants to do everything he can to help. I don't think at this point it's really so much an infatuation, which is something that develops with him later on in the season. But he just very much wants to help. He's very concerned. It's like, yes, they didn't find Will, but they found this other kid, and she's out there all alone in the rain. So obviously he wanted to help. Now next there's Lucas. And I love Lucas, but there's a lot of points with Lucas throughout this entire series, let alone just this episode, where he bothers the crap out of me. But at least the way he acts initially is a bit understandable. He's very distrustful of Eleven. He uses a lot of not nice words to describe her, that she's crazy, which Dustin actually does go along with for a little bit. Calls her crazy, a weirdo, a freak, and I don't know, he's a very combative character. He's very at odds with, he's not as compassionate as Mike, shall we say, and Dustin's just kind of along for the ride, which actually, speaking of Dustin, the poor guy's just overwhelmed by everything. It's like, in general, it seems like he's overwhelmed most of the time throughout this entire season. But especially at this point where it's like they've found this girl and like they give her some dry clothes to change into, and she starts to change right in front of him, and he's just like, holy shit, what's going on? So yeah, it's like poor Dustin, he's just so overwhelmed, but at the same time he's probably my favorite of the entire group. Not gonna lie, I love everything about Dustin, especially in the later episodes, which we'll get to. But finally, as far as the group goes, Eleven, we only know so much about her at this point, but she is very scared. Like, she is so scared that when Mike shows her the bathroom where she can go change, she's terrified of the concept of him closing that door completely. Like, She's not only scared of him closing the door, she's just flat out scared. She is terrified. And although she does manage to hide it somewhat throughout the episode and some of the upcoming episodes, that terror never really fully goes away, I don't think. She grows more comfortable with some of her surroundings, but she's always scared of what could happen, what might happen, what will happen if the bad people find her, or the bad men find her. So yeah, it's really rough for the kid, unfortunately. But yeah, it's like that's our little group. That is our cast of primary main characters, in my opinion. There's a lot more to the cast that we'll be covering, But as far as just like the primary core group, they really make it up for this season. In season 2, well, I'll get to that in a little bit. But this is also where we're established Eleven's love of Eggos. Or maybe not so much. She doesn't show the just absolute love of them yet. That comes on along later. But she is introduced to them. And just when that pops up in the episodes coming forward, it is adorable and so cute. It's like just her infatuation with Eggos. And, well, I'm not going to linger too much on other episodes. Let's keep going forward with this one. One of my favorite parts with them, too, specifically with Mike and Eleven, is when Mike ends up playing hooky because Eleven didn't want to go along with his plan, and Eleven gets a bit of a tour of the house. She's introduced to their lazy boy. She sees pictures of Mike's sister Nancy, and she's just like, pretty. And yeah, it's a nice little sequence that I really enjoyed, just him introducing her to the way things are there at the house. And then Eleven sees Will's picture, and it's one of those chilling moments, because we know at this point that she has those psychic powers. That hasn't really been shown to the others, but we know she has some powers. But then she points at Will and says that she, well, doesn't so much say really, but indicates that yes, she knows who he is. She's seen him. And that's just terrifying, really. It's, again, just such a chilling moment that this girl is like, has seen Will, or at least knows of Will, when he's been taken away by the, I guess I'll just call it the Demogorgon. I'll probably call it the Demogorgon at times. Other times I'll just call it the monster or the creature. But that's the name that they give it, essentially. But yeah, when she sees that picture, that's just such a chilling moment. And this also introduces one of the big themes of this season, at least. I don't know if it carries over later. But making a promise. Making a promise and being friends and making promises. Friends are people who never lie, or at least that's what we're told. And a promise is something that you can't break. Like, especially if you spit on it. Like, I love when Lucas does that. Dustin's just like, but yeah, a promise is something that you can't break, and especially, well, primarily really just with this group of characters, those are things that are held very closely. And whenever a promise or, like, you know, friendship is either betrayed or seems to be betrayed, they take it very seriously. And I like that. I like that they maintain this realism of what kids, at least what I was growing up, tended to be like. Is like they take things very seriously when it comes to friendships and not breaking promises. And I assume kids still do that today. It's like taking promises and such very seriously. But yeah, again, I'm really happy they went with that in regard to how they portrayed these kids. And finally, as far as this group goes, primarily focusing on Eleven, the PTSD moments, primarily when Mike has to hide Eleven in the closet, and she has those flashbacks to when she's put in that isolation chamber. It is just, I don't even know how to put it. It's so sad. Like, you can see her crying and tearing up, both within, you know, the flashback and just there in the present. And it's painful to watch because she's so young, and just the idea of someone that young experiencing that kind of trauma. I know it really happens. I know worse things happen in reality, you know, minus the psychic powers and all. But it's it's just painful to think about, and it's just another thing that attaches me so hard to her character. I just want to give her a hug and tell her everything's gonna be okay, even though it won't really be okay. Again, we're gonna touch on that in a few videos. But moving on from there, in reference to Joyce and Jonathan, and that's the group that we're gonna focus on at this point. Joyce is just losing it. Jonathan does what he can to help, but after the previous night when that phone got fried and she thought she heard Will breathing, it's like Joyce is just going off the deep end. And really, it seems like she's going off the deep end throughout the majority of this entire season. But especially at this point where really none of the characters, with the exception of maybe a few, are convinced that anything supernatural is actually real. Hopper just thinks she's nuts. Is like he does a good job of sort of talking her down and trying his best to be respectful, because he knows that she's been going through some horrible things because of all this. But it's like, he's very down to business, as opposed to just the drunken, not goof, but clearly hungover most of the previous episode. Like, Hopper is very, he's down to business at this point. It's like he is in serious mode, which is a little bit questionable considering some of the things that pop up in later episodes, but still, it's like he is down to business and ready to get things done, ready to do his best to try and find Will. And while he's skeptical of Joyce, one of the things that pops up that she says, because, she knows that she heard Will breathing on the phone. And she says, wouldn't you know your own daughters? And just knowing what little bit we know about Hopper's situation and that his daughter died, that's just such a painful moment. It's so hard to hear. And I mean, I physically cringed when that moment came up. And yeah, it's a low blow. And even she realizes it after she says it. But moving on from there, Jonathan ends up deciding to go and see his dad, Lonnie, who is estranged, the ex-husband of Joyce. And while he's going along, the song Should I Stay or Should I Go starts playing. And it gives us this really sweet flashback between Jonathan and Will. And it's this beautiful little bonding moment. It shows this love that the two brothers have for one another, also showing indications, however long ago that moment takes place, that it's definitely a broken home. Joyce is very upset with Lonnie, who isn't there. She's yelling at him over the phone. But Jonathan talks to Will about, even though Lonnie's not coming, and Will's a little bit disappointed in that, he's just like, you don't even like baseball. It's like, has he ever done anything you want to do that you enjoy? And out of that conversation comes this really nice quote, and it's one of those that I personally would say is my favorite of the season, because it's something that can relate to real life so much. It's like, you shouldn't like things because people tell you that you're supposed to. And that's Jonathan trying to instill in Will that, you can and should be your own person. You can decide what you like. You don't have to pretend to like something just to make someone happy. And again, just like as that brotherly bond, I absolutely love that they put that in there. It's such a sweet, beautiful moment. Now, other than that, when one of my favorite moments with Joyce in this episode is when she went to the general store to get a new phone, a few other things. I can't remember what else she got, but she ends it with, and a pack of camels. I don't know why, it's just such a perfect line for how frustrated and annoyed everything is at that point. And then going back to Jonathan's situation, we meet Lonnie and Cynthia, one of which we only actually see later in the series or season, being Lonnie. But yeah, Lonnie's a definition of a deadbeat dad. Cynthia, I don't even know how to describe her. She just seems kind of off, I think is a good way to put it. I'll leave it at that. But yeah, their introduction is blissfully over with rather quickly. And I would have been happy if Lonnie didn't appear later in the series, but unfortunately he does. But anyway, moving on from there. The final element of this episode is that the phone occurs again. And I say the phone because we have a situation. It's like after Joyce gets home with that phone, it's like she plugs it up, she gets the chair pulled over close because the cord is short, and she just sits there waiting for it to ring. She falls asleep, and when it finally does ring, it fries out, and then she starts following the lights, which she believes is Will, and it apparently was, or it might have been at least, but considering what pops up at the end. But it's like, it's this noticing that, there is something supernatural going on her side. And when she gets to the room, it's like she thinks that she might actually be communicating with Will, and then all of a sudden it dies, and then the thing starts coming out of the wall, and I mean, how else can you describe that moment, really, other than So yeah, it's oof. Following them along in this episode was crazy. And this actually brings me to when it comes to Hopper and his little troop, a little theory, or not theory, a little theme that carries over from the previous episode. The deputies are not great. The deputies, it's like I don't know if it's that they don't care, or if it's supposed to be this portrayal of just a super laid-back attitude, not overly taking things seriously. It's hard to say. But I really don't care for the deputies in general. They're just a huge annoyance for me. But then what they do call him on is about Benny. And we see that Benny is like, it was staged as a suicide. And that, I mean, I hate that the bad guys did that, obviously. And it clearly affected Hopper pretty heavily. It's like in the moment, you can definitely tell that it affects him because, that was his friend. He even says, it's like, when these homicides occurred in the city, it's like he didn't know him, but this was his friend. So it's just really, it's sad to see him going through something like that, because as he says later in the season, it's like, it almost seems like he's kind of cursed. But more on that later. And then finally they do find a clue in the pipes near the laboratory, which, that's visited on later in the episodes. But moving on from there, the final group of people I want to talk about are Steve and his friends, because I love them so much. Actually, that's not true. I hate Steve, and I especially hate his friends, Tom and Carolyn, I think. Tom and Carol, whatever. Anyway, I hate them. Steve doesn't do much to make me like him in this episode. In general, he, for the most part, does kind of come off more as just a kind of a typical teenager jerk, or that's really just a typical jerk in general. Nothing especially bad, per se. That comes later. But yeah, so Steve and his douchebag friends invite Nancy to come over, and Nancy wants Barb to come, and Barb tries to talk her out of it. Barb, taking the initiative, is just kind of like, this guy's no good, he's a douchebag, he hangs out with major douchebags, you probably don't want to go to this. But Nancy's like, oh no, I do, I really do want to. And then they stay, and Barb gets cut. And before they got there, like, Nancy said, well, you can make sure I don't do anything stupid. And then Nancy starts going upstairs after she's thrown in the pool, and Barb is just like, what are you doing? We should be leaving right now. And Nancy's like, it's okay. It's okay. Everything's fine. You should just go home. And then, obviously, Barb being just supremely loyal, a good friend, possibly too good of a friend, stays and waits. Or at least I assume she was waiting for Nancy, because she knew it's like eventually she would come down. She didn't know when, but eventually. And unfortunately, since she stays and waits, the blood from her cut drips into the water. And I don't know if it's that it dripped into the water or just the blood in general that the Demogorgon smell, but unfortunately Barb is taken. Barb is taken, and yeah, I hated that moment. I hated seeing that happen because we didn't get to experience much of her. She's a good friend, and well, I'll touch more on her in the next video when we cover that. But a little bit more about that situation. Jonathan, who I've felt bad for him for the most part. It's like, I've been able to empathize by and large. When he comes upon them and starts taking pictures, I'm sorry, it's super creepy. It's super creepy. He should not have been taking all those pictures when no one was looking. What that leads to, I do not agree with what happens, but it was just super creepy, and I can't stand that he did that. Ugh. And then, when it comes to just this episode really made me dislike Nancy for a short while. It's like, in the previous episode we didn't get a lot about her for me to really like or dislike, but just the way she treats Barb in this episode is really crappy. It's like, Barb is apparently her best friend for years. Like, they have been best friends since childhood. And then, just because, like, she's feeling a little crazy, she blows off her friend who is there trying to be there for her because she's a loyal friend. She's a good friend. And just, like, Nancy pressures Barb into going. She pressures Barb into, like, trying to take the drink to shotgun the beer, which ends up getting her cut. That's a bit of clumsiness on Barb's part, obviously, but at the same time, she didn't know what she was doing, and it's not exactly her fault that she cut herself accidentally. But just so much of it, it really revolves around Nancy pressuring Barb. And again, it really bothered me, and for a short while at least, I really just didn't care for Nancy. She wasn't as low as Steve and his friends, but she was still pretty low down there. Thankfully that does change down the line, but hey, that's not the focus of this episode at least. So, that's my thoughts on episode 2 of the first season of Stranger Things. If you have anything you would like to share, anything in particular that stood out to you about this episode, something that you really liked or something that really annoyed you, let me know in the comments down below. I'm very interested to hear what you will have to say. So, yeah, that's it for episode 2. If you want to go ahead and jump to the end of this playlist and get my overall thoughts on this series, the first season, then you can click here. Or if you want to move on to episode 3, you can click here. And I'll see you in the next video, whichever you choose.